Hey, waiter, move along. You're blocking my view. Look at those shoes. Who let a man like that in here? Hold still, sweetheart. Let me give you something that matches the outfit. Oh my God, she actually did it. 400 people in the Rothmore Hotel ballroom laughed out loud the night that plate of cake hit the man's face square on. His suit cost $40 from a second-hand store on Halsted Street, and every guest in that room had already decided exactly what he was worth. Not one of them asked his name. If somebody had said it out loud that evening, half the room would have set their glasses down and walked straight out the door, because the man standing there with frosting sliding down his collar was Lucian Moretti, and there are men in this city who don't sleep for a week after they hear that name spoken. He didn't shout, he didn't wipe his face. He just stood there, perfectly still, and let the laughter roll over him, while the woman who'd done it turned back to her friends like she'd told a good joke. She had no idea she'd just made the worst mistake of her life, and she couldn't have known that she wasn't the one who'd decide how the night ended either. Because in that whole ballroom, out of 400 people, only one of them wasn't laughing. Nobody had bothered to look at her all evening. Nobody in that room would remember her name by morning. But what she did in the 20 seconds that followed is the reason this story exists at all. If this story moves you, drop a like so more folks can find it. Share it with someone who needs to hear it tonight, and subscribe, because we tell one of these every week. Now, let's head back to that ballroom, and to the 20 seconds that changed everything. A hand came up beside him, holding a folded white napkin, and it was shaking. Not much, just enough that the linen trembled at the edges. The hand belonged to a woman in a gray janitor's uniform, the kind of uniform 400 people had walked past all evening without registering that anyone was inside it, and she didn't ask permission, and she didn't say a word. She went down on one knee in front of him, the way a person kneels when the work matters more than how it looks, and she began to wipe the frosting from his jaw, slowly, one small stroke at a time. She started at the corner of his mouth, because that was the part that would have been hardest for him to bear, and she worked outward toward his cheek, and then up along the bridge of his nose, and then she folded the napkin over to find a clean side and started again. Somebody in the crowd let out a laugh that died halfway through. Then it was quiet. Not the quiet of a room that has finished laughing, the quiet of a room that has just realized it's being watched by something it doesn't understand. 20 seconds. That's how long it went on. 20 seconds in a ballroom of 400 people where nobody said anything at all, and the only sound was linen moving against skin, and a woman breathing carefully through her nose, because she was trying very hard not to let her hands shake worse than they already were. She was afraid. Anyone standing close enough could see it. She was afraid the way a person is afraid when they've done the math and know exactly what this is going to cost them, and have decided to pay it anyway. Lucian Moretti didn't move. He had spent his adult life in rooms where every hand that came toward his face came with a purpose he'd already calculated, and he had no file for this one. He looked down at her and she looked up at him, and she said, quietly, so quietly that only the nearest tables caught it, "You didn't deserve that. Nobody does." Then she stood. Her knee was wet from the carpet. She still had the napkin balled in her fist. And Vivian Crandall, who had been enjoying herself, who had already turned back to her circle with the easy confidence of a woman who has never once been made to answer for anything, looked her up and down and smiled. "Oh, isn't that sweet?" Vivian said, the help sticking together. A few people laughed. Not as many as before. The woman in the gray uniform didn't laugh. She didn't look away either. She looked directly at Vivian Crandall, and her voice, when it came, was small and steady and carried farther than it had any right to. 8:41, she said. "By the coat room, the Sawyer file, and Mrs. Doyle. I heard all of it." What happened to Vivian Crandall's face after that was something the people standing nearest her would talk about for a long time afterward. The color went out of it in stages. First the flush along her throat, then the warmth in her cheeks, then everything else, until what was left was a woman holding a champagne glass she seemed to have forgotten she was holding. Her lips parted. Nothing came out. Somewhere behind her, her husband set down his drink. "I don't want money," the woman in the gray uniform said. "I don't want anything from you. I want you to apologize to him. Here. Out loud, where they can all hear it. 400 people. Nobody moved. A waiter froze with a tray half raised. The string quartet had stopped somewhere in the last minute, and none of them could say exactly when. Vivian Crandall's mouth worked once, twice, And then she turned toward the man with the frosting still drying on his collar, and in a voice that had no shape left in it, she said, "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." The woman nodded once. That was all. She didn't gloat. She didn't press. She didn't take the extra second that anyone else would have taken. And later, that was the part Lucian would keep coming back to. She simply bent down and began picking up the pieces of the broken plate, gathering the larger shards into her palm and running her fingers along the carpet for the small ones so no one would cut themselves. And when she'd gotten them all, she stood up with the wreckage cupped in one hand and the napkin in the other, and walked toward the service door at the back of the ballroom, past the tables, past the people who were still not laughing, and she went through it without looking back, and it swung shut behind her with a soft click that half the room heard. Lucian Moretti stood where he was. He had come into this building with a plan, and every step of that plan had assumed he would be the one holding the leverage by the end of the night. And now something had happened that his plan had no room for. He was 37 years old. For 20 years, in every room he'd walked into, he had known precisely what he intended to do next. He looked at the service door. He looked down at his hands, and for the first time in all those years, he had absolutely no idea. 14 hours earlier, in a house in Lake Forest that sat well back from the road behind a stand of old oaks, 2 men were sitting in the front room when Lucian Moretti came down the stairs, and both of them stood up. They didn't discuss it. They didn't look at each other first. They simply rose the way men rise when the room they're in stops being theirs. And they stayed standing until he had passed through and turned the corner toward the back of the house. A woman carrying linens came the other way down the hall and pressed herself against the wall to let him by, and she kept her eyes on the floorboards the entire time, and she said good morning to a spot roughly 18 inches to the left of him. He had stopped noticing this a long time ago. That was the thing about it. A man doesn't notice whether he's lived in his whole life. His mother was already at the breakfast table when he got there, and she did not stand up, and she did not lower her eyes, and she had a sheet of paper folded in half beside her coffee cup. Rosalind Moretti was 68 years old, and she had been widowed for 11 of them, and in all the years since, she had remained the only person alive who could look her son in the face and hold it. "Sit down," she said. He sat. She slid the paper across the table without ceremony, the way you'd pass the salt. He didn't need to open it. He knew her handwriting, and he knew what was written on it, because he had watched her write it 30 days ago at this same table while he laughed at her. 30 days. Find me a woman who loves you for you, and not for the name. He hadn't laughed since about day 19. "Yesterday was the 30th, Rosalind said. "I'm aware. You didn't call me. There was nothing to call about." She nodded slowly, and she picked up her coffee, and she took a sip and set it down again, with the small precision of a woman who has already decided how a conversation is going to go and is simply walking through it. "You lost?" she said. "I lost." "Then you'll take the penalty." I said I would. She smiled at him then, not warmly. It was the smile she'd worn his entire childhood, the one that arrived about 4 seconds before something he wasn't going to enjoy. "One day," she said, "tomorrow, from the time you wake up until the time you come home, you'll be an ordinary man." He waited. There was always more with her. "No name," she said. "You don't give it, you don't use it, you don't let anyone hand it to you. No more than $60 in cash, and no cards, no driver, nobody with you. Not Gianni, not anybody, not 2 blocks behind and not 1 block behind." He watched her. "And you'll wear what I pick out." That was when he understood she'd been planning this since before the 30 days were up. There was a garment bag already hanging on the back of the pantry door, and it had been hanging there long enough that he had walked past it twice that week without asking. Wool that had gone thin at the elbows, a jacket the color of wet pavement, shoes that had belonged to somebody who worked for a living and had worked in them. "You've had that ready?" he said. "For 19 days. Mother, you want to argue about the terms?" She raised an eyebrow. "You made the bet. Nobody held a gun to your head, and I'd know, because in this family somebody usually is." He sat back in the chair. Outside, past the window, one of the men from the front room was walking the fence line the way he did every morning, and the world was arranged exactly as it had been arranged for 20 years, and his mother had just told him to step out of it for a day like a man stepping out of a warm car into January. "What do you think one day is going to teach me?" he said. He didn't say it unkindly. He said it the way a man says a thing he's already decided the answer to. Rosalind looked at him for a long moment. "It isn't going to teach you anything," she said. I'm not trying to teach you. I'm going to show you something. Show me what? That's the point of showing, she said. If I could tell you, I'd have told you 31 days ago and saved us both the trouble. Then she coughed. It came up out of her fast and low, and she turned her head into her shoulder, and her hand went down to the napkin in her lap. When she brought the napkin up to her mouth, something moved underneath it, small, white, gone into her palm and then gone entirely, and the napkin came back to the table folded the way it had been, and she reached for her coffee with a steady hand and drank. Lucian saw it. He saw all of it, the way he saw everything, because seeing things was the reason he was still alive at 37, when most of the men his father had trained were not. He looked at his mother, and his mother looked back at him, and there was a question sitting in the middle of the table between them, and he did not ask it. That was Tuesday morning. By the following evening, he'd be standing in a ballroom with cake on his face, wearing her jacket, and she would be right about all of it. Here is the part that nobody in that ballroom would ever understand, and the part that made everything else possible. Lucian Moretti didn't wander into the Rothmore Hotel that night because his mother had dressed him in a dead man's jacket and turned him loose on the city. He went there because of an envelope. It had arrived at the office on Wacker 3 weeks earlier. Plain, no return address, no postmark that meant anything. Hand-delivered to the front desk by a courier nobody could later describe. Inside were 9 pages. No note, no demand, just columns. Money leaving accounts that belonged to him, moving twice, sometimes 3 times, and landing in something called the Safe Harbor Foundation, which was the charitable arm of the Crandall family, and which existed, according to its own materials, to help the families of construction workers who'd been hurt or killed on the job. He read the 9 pages twice at his desk, and then a 3rd time standing at the window. The amounts weren't large. That was the first thing that bothered him. Men who steal from a house like his steal big, because the risk is identical whether you take 50,000 or 500,000, and so they take 500,000. These were small and regular and patient, and they had been going on for a long time, and they had the quality of something that wasn't theft at all, but arrangement. The second thing that bothered him was simpler. He hadn't authorized any of it. He hadn't been asked. In 20 years, he had signed off on things that would keep an ordinary man awake for the rest of his life, and he had never once been kept out of a room in his own house. Somebody had been moving his money into a United States congressman's charity for years, and had gone to the trouble of making sure the man whose name was on that money never heard about it. So he did what he always did, which was to say nothing and start looking. He brought it to Adrian Voss on a Thursday, because Voss was the only person he'd ever brought anything to first. Voss had been his father's right hand for as long as Lucian had been alive. A heavy, patient man of 45, with reading glasses he was vain about, and a memory that made ledgers unnecessary, and when the old man died 11 years ago, Voss could have taken the whole thing and half the city would have shrugged and let him. He didn't. He stayed. He stood behind a 26-year-old kid at the funeral and made it clear with his body where he intended to remain, and he had remained there ever since. Voss put on the glasses, read the 9 pages the way he read everything, slowly, top to bottom, no skipping. Then he took the glasses off. "Somebody wants you looking at the Crandalls," he said. "Or somebody wants me looking away from something else. Could be." Voss folded the pages and set them down and put his hand flat on top of them. "You want me to go turn it over?" And Lucian, who trusted this man the way you trust a wall you've leaned on your entire life, said no. Not because he doubted him. He said it because of something Voss himself had taught him when he was 19 years old and full of certainty. When a thing doesn't make sense, don't send, go. Send a man and you get his eyes, his judgment, his interpretation, and every one of those is a filter, and the truth arrives at you already sanded down. Go yourself, and you get the room. So he decided to get the room. The Safe Harbor Foundation held one event a year, a fundraising gala at the Rothmore in the 2nd week of October, 400 seats at $1,000 a plate, and every person on that guest list who mattered to those 9 pages would be standing under the same chandeliers on the same evening. He could have walked in as himself. That was the trouble. If Lucian Moretti walks into a room, the room rearranges itself around him before he's through the door. Conversations stop and restart in a different key. Men who were about to shake hands don't. Whatever he'd come to see would fold itself up and put itself away. And he'd learn nothing except that everybody knew he was watching. And then his mother had slid a folded piece of paper across a breakfast table and told him that for 1 full day he would have no name, no car, no driver, and nobody at his shoulder. He'd sat in that kitchen chair and understood that she had, without meaning to, and without knowing anything about it, handed him the one thing he'd been unable to buy. A face nobody would look at twice. So he took the terms. All of them. Every single one. Exactly as written. He told Gianni Renzi to sit 3 blocks east on Ontario and not to move. Not for any reason. Not unless he called. Gianni, who was 33 and had never in 6 years questioned an instruction, questioned that one. 3 blocks, boss. 3 blocks. That's a long way if something goes sideways. Nothing's going sideways, Lucian said. Nobody in that building has any idea who I am. That's the entire point. He would remember saying that. Later, standing in the hallway outside the ballroom, with frosting drying on his collar, he would remember saying that word for word, and he would understand that he had been right, and that being right had cost him something he hadn't known he owned. Ellie Sawyer had been in the building since 2 o'clock that afternoon, which was 6 hours before the first guest arrived, because the basement corridors of the Rothmore take longer to clean than the parts anyone photographs. She was 29 years old and she worked 3 jobs. Mornings, she stocked shelves at a grocery on Halstead before the store opened. 2 afternoons a week, she cleaned a dental office in Bridgeport, and 5 nights out of 7 she was here, on the overnight contract, running a mop down 1,100 feet of service hallway that connected the loading dock to the kitchens to the freight elevators, floors that nobody would ever see, and that she was nonetheless expected to leave clean enough to eat from. She was good at it. That's a thing people don't often say about the work, but she was. She knew which corners held water, and which drains backed up, if you were careless with the wringer. And she could tell by the sound a wheel made whether the cart needed oil. At 6:20, her phone buzzed against her hip. She let it go the first time. It buzzed again at 6:22, and she leaned the mop handle into the corner and took the phone out and sat down on the second step of the stairwell by the ice machine to read it. It was from St. Genevieve Care Center in Blue Island, and the subject line said, "Notice of Rate Adjustment." And the body of it took 4 paragraphs to say that beginning the 1st of next month, the monthly cost of her mother's memory care unit would increase by $400. She read it twice. Then she opened her bank app and looked at the balance, and she sat there on the second step with the phone in both hands and did the arithmetic she had already done in her head before the app finished loading. It didn't work. It hadn't worked for some time now, and this made it not work by 400 more. She stayed there for a little while. Not long. The ice machine cycled once and dumped a load into the bin behind her, and she flinched slightly at the sound, and then she put the phone back in her pocket and stood up and picked up the mop and finished the corridor, because the corridor was still dirty whether or not the arithmetic worked. At 7:15, the kitchen sent down 2 hotel pans of leftover roll bread from the afternoon setup, headed for the trash the way it went every single night, and Ellie stood at the end of the prep counter and ate 4 of them standing up with a paper towel under her chin, so she wouldn't have to sweep after herself. She didn't take any with her. She'd been told once about the policy, and she never asked whether anybody actually enforced it. At 7:40, she called her mother. She stepped into the stairwell for it, because the reception was better there, and because the call went the way it went, and she preferred to have it alone. The aide put the phone to Marion's ear. "Hi, Mom. It's Ellie." "Nothing." Then a sound, not quite a word. "Mom, it's Ellie." A pause long enough that she looked at the screen to see whether the call had dropped. "It's Ellie, Mom. Your daughter." And then, finally, out of somewhere, in a voice thin as tissue paper, her mother said, "Well, hello, honey." Ellie closed her eyes and put her forehead against the cool of the stairwell wall and smiled at nothing. They talked for 6 minutes. Her mother told her about a woman down the hall who sang, and told her about it twice. And Ellie said that sounded nice both times, with exactly the same warmth in her voice. And when the aide came back on and said they were getting ready for supper, Ellie said thank you, and meant it, and hung up and stood there another few seconds before she went back out. At 8 o'clock, Denise found her by the freight elevator. Denise ran the night crew for Brightline Facility Services, and she'd been doing it 18 years, and she was not unkind. She was simply tired in a way that had become permanent. She handed Ellie a radio and a fresh stack of towels. "Ballroom's live at 8:30, Denise said. 400 people tonight. Senators, money, the whole thing." She checked something off on the clipboard without looking up. "You've got spills and coat room only. In and out. Nobody stops working. But honey, listen to me. 400 guests up there tonight. Don't let any of them see you." Ellie said okay. She didn't hear it as cruelty. because it wasn't meant as cruelty. It was the instruction she'd been given in one form or another at every job she'd ever held, and she'd long since stopped hearing the shape of it. She took the towels. Before she went up, she did one more thing, and it was the small, ordinary thing she did at the start of every overnight shift, and had done for years. She stopped at the crew lockers and took off her work shoes, and set them inside a plastic grocery bag, knotted the handles, and put the bag in her locker, and slid her feet into the flat canvas ones she walked home in. The work shoes cost $62, and she needed them to last through winter, and the walk from the Rothmore to the bus transfer, and then from the transfer to her block, came to about 1.5 miles, and there was no sense putting that mileage on them. Then she straightened up, clipped the radio to her belt, and rode the freight elevator to the lobby level, where 400 people were beginning to arrive and where, in a little under an hour, she would be the only one of them who wasn't laughing. The young man working the guest list looked at the jacket first, then the shoes, and then he lifted his chin toward the far end of the corridor and said the service entrance was around the back. He said it politely. He said it the way you give directions to someone who's clearly lost, and there was nothing in his face that he'd have been ashamed of later if he'd known. Lucian took the invitation out of his inside pocket and handed it over without a word. It was printed with the name of a holding company registered in Delaware, one of 9 such names that appeared on nothing anybody could trace back to him, and it had been mailed to that company's address in August the way it was mailed every year. And it was perfectly good. The young man read it twice. The color came up in his neck. He said, "Of course, sir. I apologize. Please go right in." And he stepped aside, and Lucian went past him into the ballroom and let the door of that small moment close behind him without touching it again. Inside, he began to read the room, which is a thing he'd been trained to do before he was old enough to drive. You don't watch faces. Faces lie all evening long without effort. You watch hands, and you watch feet, and above all, you watch who moves toward whom, because in a room like that one, want has a direction, and it shows. He worked his way along the wall on the north side, past the silent auction tables, and he stayed where the light was poor. 3 things happened to him in the first half hour, and he made note of none of them at the time. A woman in gray silk who was looking over her shoulder at somebody else pressed an empty champagne flute into his hand as she passed, the way you'd set a glass on a shelf, and kept walking. A man asked him where the restrooms were and then asked a second man the same question 10 seconds later. And near the bar, a fellow of about 34, with a very good haircut and a lapel pin shaped like a small brass anchor, stopped mid-sentence, looked him up and down, and said, loud enough to carry across 2 tables, "Friend, this fund is for working people. It isn't by working people. I think you want the other event." The group around him laughed. Blake Hartigan enjoyed it enough to look for someone to share it with, and he found her 4 steps away, and he raised his hand and called out, Vivienne, come look at this." Lucian didn't turn toward Blake Hartigan. He was looking past him, over his shoulder, at something on the other side of the room, and what he was looking at was Warren Crandall shaking a man's hand in the doorway near the stage. The congressman had both hands on it. He was leaning in the way a man leans when he's saying something short and important, and the man he was saying it to was standing with his weight back on his heels, listening, and that man worked for Lucian, not close in, not anybody who'd ever been in a room with him alone. A driver out of the yard on Cermak, a man he could put a first name to and not much else. Warren Crandall let go of the hand and clapped him twice on the upper arm and walked off toward the stage, and the driver stood there for a second and then went out the door, and the whole thing had taken perhaps 11 seconds. Lucian set the empty champagne flute down on a table and did not move for some time. 60 feet away and 1 wall over, Ellie Sawyer was on her knees beside the coat room with a towel, working a spilled glass of red out of the runner carpet before it set. She had learned to be furniture. It's a skill, and it takes practice. And the practice is mostly in the shoulders, in keeping them low and turned away, and in never once looking up at a face. So the woman standing on the other side of the folding screen didn't lower her voice, because there was nobody there to lower it for. Ellie heard heels stop. She heard a phone come out of a clutch, and then she heard a woman's voice, tight and fast. Nothing like the voice that woman had been using out in the ballroom all evening. "It's me. Listen to me. Bury the Sawyer file. All of it. The whole thing. I don't care how." A pause. "Don't tell me that. The subpoena came to the house. It came to my house. Do you understand what I'm telling you?" Another pause. Longer. "Then you make sure it never gets to Doyle's desk. Not to Doyle. Are we clear?" The heels moved. The clutch snapped shut. Ellie stayed exactly where she was, on her knees, one hand flat on the wet carpet, and she found that she was holding her breath, and had been for a while. She didn't know what a Sawyer file was. She knew her own last name when she heard it, and she knew that whatever this was, it was the kind of thing people go to a great deal of trouble to make sure nobody hears. So she did the only thing that occurred to her. She took her phone out of her back pocket, opened the notes, and typed the time. 8:41, coat room, Sawyer file, Doyle. Then she put the phone away and finished the carpet, and she gathered her towel and went out through the ballroom doors to get a fresh one, and she was halfway across the back of the room when she heard a woman's voice ahead of her say, sweetly, brightly, to somebody standing very still, "Hold still, sweetheart." He walked out through the lobby and down the marble steps onto Ontario Street, and he called Gianni from the sidewalk. Gianni picked up on half a ring, which meant he'd had the phone in his hand for the better part of 2 hours. "Boss, stand down," Lucian said. "Nothing tonight." There was a silence on the line of the kind Gianni Renzi had never once put there in 6 years. "Boss, I've been sitting here watching people come out of that building, and a couple of them were laughing about something, and I've got a real bad feeling about what." "Stand down. Just tell me nobody put a hand on you." "Somebody did," Lucian said. "And nothing happens tonight. Nothing happens tomorrow. Nobody makes a call. Nobody drives past anything. Nobody asks a question. That comes from me," he heard Gianni breathe out. "Understood. Go home." He hung up and stood there on the sidewalk in his mother's borrowed jacket with the collar stiffening as it dried, and he was still holding the napkin. He hadn't noticed that he'd kept it. He looked at it, a wadded square of hotel linen with frosting ground into the weave, and then, for no reason he could have explained to another living person, he lifted it toward his face. It smelled like floor cleaner, pine and ammonia, the cheap institutional kind that comes in a gallon jug, and it was on her hands, and her hands had been on the napkin, and now the smell was in the cloth. 20 years of his life had smelled like cigars and leather and money and the inside of cars. And here was a woman who smelled like the work, and she had gotten down on one knee on a wet carpet in front of 400 people to clean somebody else's humiliation off a stranger's face. He folded the napkin along its own creases and put it in his breast pocket. At 9:40 the next morning, Ellie Sawyer got a phone call while she was restocking a cooler at the grocery on Halstead. It was Denise, and Denise didn't waste any time on it because there wasn't any way to stretch it into something better. The hotel had complained. Not a guest. The hotel, which meant somebody upstairs had made a call, and the language in the complaint was that a Brightline employee had engaged a guest in an altercation on the ballroom floor in front of the client's invited attendees. Brightline had 11 contracts in the loop, and the Rothmore was the biggest of them. "I fought for you," Denise said, and Ellie believed her, because Denise's voice was doing something Ellie had never heard it do. "I told them what I know about you, which is 9 months of never one problem. It didn't matter. Honey, it was already decided before they called me." "I understand," Ellie said. "There's a girl in the office who'll mail you the paperwork." "Okay." "Ellie." Denise stopped. "What in God's name happened up there?" "Somebody needed help," Ellie said, "and I helped him." And that was the entire report she ever gave anybody about it. The paperwork came the following afternoon in a windowed envelope, and the second page was the health coverage notice, the one that explains your continuation rights, and tells you that you may elect to keep the same plan by paying the full monthly premium yourself. The number was $741. She stood in the vestibule of her building, with the mail in one hand, and read that figure the way you read a word in a language you studied once and have mostly lost. The grocery gave her 22 hours a week. The dental office gave her 8. She put the envelope in her bag and went upstairs and did not sit down, because she'd learned somewhere along the line that sitting down was how it got you. At 4:15, the buzzer rang. She wasn't expecting anybody. He was standing on the front steps in the same wool jacket, and it took her a full second and a half to place him, because there'd been frosting all over the lower half of his face the only other time she'd seen it. "How did you find me?" she said. "I asked at the hotel. That wasn't how, and they both knew it wasn't how, and he didn't offer anything better." He took an envelope out of his coat, a plain white one, thick, and he held it out to her. "This is for you." Ellie looked at it. Then she put her hand flat against it and pushed it back toward his chest. "No, you should take it. I didn't wipe your face to get this." She said it evenly. There was nothing sharp in it at all, which is what made it land the way it did. He didn't move his arm. He stood there with the envelope still extended, and she pushed it back a second time, more firmly, and this time he let his hand drop. "You lost your job because of me," he said. "I lost my job because I chose to," Ellie said. "That's different." He looked at her for a long moment. In 20 years there had been a great many people who wanted things from him, and a great many people who were afraid of him, and there had never once been a person who simply declined and then went on standing there in the doorway, unafraid and unmoved, and entirely finished with the subject. He didn't have anything to say. That was the plain truth of it. He put the envelope back inside his coat, and he said, "All right," and then he said, "I'll leave you a number." He wrote it on the back of a grocery receipt he found in his pocket, because he didn't have anything else, and he set it on the ledge by the buzzer panel, and he went down the steps. She watched him get to the sidewalk. Then she closed the door and left the receipt where it was. The receipt sat on the ledge by the buzzer panel for 3 days, and nobody in the building touched it. And Ellie went up and down those stairs 11 times and looked at it 11 times and left it where it was. On the 3rd day, the letter came from St. Genevieve. It was not the rate adjustment this time. It was the other one. The one that used the phrase 30 days to remedy the outstanding balance and the phrase transition planning in the same paragraph. And at the bottom there was a line about how families were encouraged to contact the social services office regarding placement alternatives. And Ellie read that line 4 times before she understood that placement alternatives meant somewhere else, somewhere that would take a woman with no money, and that her mother, who could no longer reliably say her own daughter's name, would be moved out of a room she had finally learned the shape of. She stood in the vestibule holding that letter for a long time. Then she went out to the ledge by the buzzer panel and picked up the grocery receipt, and she carried it upstairs, and she sat on the edge of her bed with her thumb on the keypad for a good while before she dialed. He answered on the 2nd ring. She had rehearsed nothing, so what came out was the truth, which was that she needed work, and that she needed the kind that came with health coverage, and that she was asking because she had run out of other doors. He said he had something. She said, "Wait." And then she said the thing she had actually called to say. "I want it to be a real job, not charity dressed up. If it's a made-up position where they hand me a paycheck and everybody knows I don't do anything, I'd rather starve. And I mean that. I'm not being proud at you. I've been the person people are nice to. It's worse." There was a pause on his end. "It's a real job," he said. "Facilities supervisor. 3rd shift, 4 floors, 7 people under you. The last woman who had it retired in June and nobody's replaced her. You'll earn it. Then yes, Monday, 6 in the evening, 211 East Wacker." Monday evening, she came in through the lobby of a building on East Wacker, with her name printed on a temporary badge and a clipboard she hadn't been given anything to write on yet. Nobody had briefed her on whose building it was. She'd been given a company name, Moretti Harbor Group, and she'd typed it into her phone on the bus and gotten a website with photographs of shipping terminals and a page about port logistics that told her exactly nothing, and she'd put the phone away and thought no more about it. The night manager walked her through the ground floor, showed her the supply room and the loading bay and the panel that controlled the freight elevators, and then he got a call and left her in the lobby with a cart while he went to deal with something. And she did what she always did in the first hour of any job anywhere, which was to start working. There was a scuff on the floor near the elevator bank. She crouched down with a rag. She was still down there when the elevator chimed. What she noticed first was the sound of the room, not the doors opening. The room. There were perhaps 15 or 16 men in that lobby, standing around in 2s and 3s the way men do in a lobby at 6 in the evening, talking, and every conversation in the place stopped inside the same half-second, cleanly, the way a radio stops when the power goes. Then they stood. All of them, together, without any signal she could see, chairs scraping back, hands coming out of pockets, and a voice near the door said, "Evening, Mr. Moretti." She turned her head. He came out of the elevator in a dark suit and a dark coat, with 2 men falling in behind him a step and a half back, and his face was the face she had knelt in front of on a ballroom carpet, and the rag went out of her hand and landed on the marble with a small wet sound that she heard and nobody else did. He saw her. She watched him see her. Something moved behind his eyes and was put away again, and he did not stop walking, and he went through the lobby and out the doors and was gone in maybe 4 seconds. The men sat back down. The conversations restarted in a lower key. Ellie stayed exactly where she was, crouched by the elevator bank with her hand still open where the rag had been, And the thought that arrived in her was not the one anybody would have expected. It wasn't he's rich. She'd already half known that, or known something close enough to it, since the moment a man in a $40 jacket found her address without being able to say how. It wasn't he lied to me either, because he never had. The thought that came up through her, cold, from the bottom, was this. If I hadn't stepped out that night, if I'd stayed by the coat room with my towel and let it go the way I've let 100 other things go, what would he have done to that woman? By the next morning, she wouldn't have had anything left to lose. She picked up the rag. Her hands weren't steady. She finished the scuff on the floor, because the scuff was still there. And then she stood up and went to find the night manager and asked him what he wanted done next. She worked the rest of that shift and the next one, and the one after that. And on Thursday evening, the night manager came and found her on the 4th floor and said she was wanted upstairs. And he said it in a careful voice, the way a man says a thing he doesn't want any part of. She rode up alone. The office at the end of the hall had one lamp on and the rest of it in shadow, and he was standing at the window with his back to the room when she came in, and he turned around and told her to sit, and she didn't. She stood just inside the door with her hands at her sides, and she could feel them shaking, and she let them shake, because she had decided somewhere around the 2nd floor landing that she was going to ask, and that being frightened while she asked was simply the price of asking. "You let them do it," she said. He waited. That whole night. All of it. The man at the bar. The woman with the glass. All of them. You let it happen. She swallowed. You were watching them, weren't you? You wanted to see what kind of people they were. Yes, he said. There was no hesitation in it at all, and no pride either, and that was somehow worse than if he'd lied. Ellie stood there. Her heart was going hard enough that she could hear it, and if I hadn't come out, she said. He didn't answer. She waited. She waited a good deal longer than a person normally waits for an answer, and the room stayed quiet, and the lamp hummed faintly, and he looked at her across all that dark carpet with an expression she couldn't read, and would spend a long time afterward trying to. Then, by the next morning, he said at last, that woman would have had nothing left to lose. Ellie put her hand out and set it flat on the back of the chair in front of her, because she needed to. She had understood, all week, in a general and shapeless way, that she'd walked into the middle of something. This was different. This had a size to it. She thought about Vivian Crandall standing there with the champagne glass she'd forgotten she was holding, and about the color going out of that woman's face in stages, and she understood, all at once and completely, that when she'd knelt down on that carpet, she had not been rescuing the man in front of her. He had never for 1 second been in danger. She had been rescuing the woman standing behind her, the one who'd done it, the one who'd laughed. I didn't do it for her, Ellie said. Her voice came out lower than she meant it to. I didn't even know she was there anymore. I wasn't thinking about her at all. I was thinking about you. I know. That's not the same as forgiving her. It isn't. And I'm not going to stand here and tell you I'm glad, or that it worked out, or any of that. She looked at the floor for a moment and then made herself look back up. I don't know what you do. I've got some idea, and I've decided I don't want the rest of it. And if that makes me a coward, then all right. I'm a coward, but I'm not going to pretend I feel good about any of this. I didn't ask you to. No, she said. You didn't. He came away from the window then and crossed to the desk, and he picked up a folder and held it out. And she took it because her hands did it before she'd decided. Inside was an employment packet. Facilities supervisor. 3rd shift. 4 floors. 7 employees. A schedule. A pay rate that made her read the line twice. And a benefits election form with an effective date already typed in for the 1st of the month. This is real, he said. The position existed before I ever met you, and it'll exist after. Nobody's doing you a favor. If you don't do the work, you'll be replaced. And I'd tell you the same thing if you were anyone else, and I want you to hear that. Why? Because you asked me for a real job. Ellie looked down at the pages. $741 a month had been sitting on her kitchen table in a windowed envelope for 11 days now, and here in her hands was a form that made that number go away entirely, and behind that number was a woman in a memory care unit in Blue Island who could not always find her daughter's name, but who had learned the shape of that room. She thought about the letter with the phrase placement alternatives in it. She thought about what it would mean to say no to this out of pride, and who would actually pay for that particular luxury, and it wouldn't be her. I'll take it, she said. All right. I want to say something first. She looked up. I'm taking it because of my mother. Not because of you. And not because I'm grateful, and I want that said out loud in this room, so it's said. Understood. And if I ever find out that the work I'm doing is helping something I couldn't live with, I'll walk out that night, and I won't give notice. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he nodded once. That's fair, he said. And it was the first time in 20 years that anybody had set terms with Lucian Moretti and had them accepted the way they were offered, and neither of them noticed it, and only one of them would ever understand what it meant. It was 3 weeks later that he asked her to come out to Lake Forest on a Sunday, and he asked it badly, the way a man asks who has never once had to ask anybody for anything socially. And Ellie said yes, mostly because she wanted to see what a person like him came from. His mother met her at the side door before the car had finished pulling away, and looked her over from her shoes to her hairline in about 2 seconds, and said, "You're taller than he said," and handed her a paper sack of green beans and a bowl. "Sit. You can snap those while we talk. I don't like a guest with empty hands. It makes them nervous." So Ellie sat at the kitchen table across from Rosalind Moretti with a bowl in her lap, snapping the ends off green beans, while her son stood in the doorway for a minute and was then dismissed with a small motion of 2 fingers that Ellie found remarkable, because she had watched 15 grown men stand up in a lobby for that same person, and here he went, out of the room, without a word. "Now," Rosalind said, once he was gone, "do you know what my son does for a living?" Ellie's hands kept moving. She had thought about how she'd answer this, in a general way, on the drive out. "I know enough to be afraid of him," she said. Rosalind nodded slowly, and something happened around her eyes that wasn't quite a smile. "Good," she said. "The ones who aren't afraid of him are the ones who want to use him. It's the ones who come in easy and comfortable that I never sleep for." She took a bean out of Ellie's bowl and snapped it herself and dropped it back in, apparently just to have done it. "9 months ago there was a girl at this table who told me she'd never heard of us, sitting in this house." She snorted. "You at least have the decency to be scared." They worked through half the sack before Rosalind said, in exactly the same tone she'd used about the beans, "Did he ever tell you about the bet?" "What bet?" "Huh." The old woman sat back. "Of course he didn't." She wiped her fingers on a towel. "In September I gave him 30 days. Find a woman who loves you for you and not for the name." He laughed at me. He laughed for about 2.5 weeks, and then he stopped laughing, which is how I knew he'd started actually trying. And he lost. "What happens when he loses?" "He pays," Rosalind said. "That was the arrangement." So I told him. 1 whole day as an ordinary man. No name, no driver, no car, nobody standing behind him, $60 in his pocket, and not 1 cent more, and he wears what I put in the bag. Ellie's hands stopped. She looked up. "You made him be a normal person for a day. That was the punishment." "That's right. That's the punishment." And then Ellie laughed, out loud, honestly, before she could stop herself, and she put her hand over her mouth immediately, and Rosalind Moretti watched her do it with an expression of enormous satisfaction. "You may laugh in my kitchen," she said. "God knows nobody else does. I'm sorry. It's only that I've been ordinary my whole life, and nobody's ever handed it to me as a sentence. Which is precisely why it works on him." Rosalind picked up another bean. "And I'll tell you what I actually did, since you're sitting here. I didn't sentence him to be an ordinary man. I sentenced him to see one. There's a difference, and it's the whole difference. That boy has walked past 10,000 people who mop floors and pour drinks and hold doors, and he has never once looked at a single one of them, not because he's cruel, he isn't, but because nobody ever told him they were there." She let that sit for a second. "So he lost. That much he knows." Then she leaned in slightly, and her voice dropped, and there was something underneath it that Ellie couldn't get a hold of. "But I've never told him what I was betting on. He thinks he knows. He doesn't." Ellie waited for the rest of it. It didn't come. Rosalind reached for her coffee and drank, and the subject was closed with the finality of a door, and they went back to the beans. It was another few minutes before Ellie noticed the pill organizer on the counter by the window, the long plastic kind with a compartment for each day of the week, and beside it 2 amber bottles, and she read the labels the way anybody's eyes read a label they're sitting 3 feet from, and she recognized one of the names because there had been a man in her mother's building on the same thing after his second event. She looked up. Rosalind was already watching her. The old woman held her gaze steadily for a moment, and then she lifted 1 finger and laid it across her lips, and she held it there, and she didn't blink. Ellie looked toward the doorway where he'd gone out. Then she looked back. And she nodded, once, and picked up another bean. And neither of them ever mentioned it again. He drove her out to Blue Island himself on a Wednesday, because the bus took an hour and 40 minutes each way and she'd mentioned it once, in passing, not as a complaint, and he'd remembered it the way he remembered everything. He parked and she said he could wait in the car and he got out anyway. St. Genevieve smelled like every place of its kind smells, and the hallway had a handrail all the way down both sides, and Marion Sawyer was in the chair by the window with a folded blanket across her knees. "Hi, Mom. It's Ellie." Her mother looked at her with great friendliness and no recognition at all. It was a good look, an open one, the kind you'd give a pleasant stranger who had come to sit with you, and Ellie took it the way she took it every time, which was steadily, and she pulled the second chair over and sat down and started talking about nothing in particular. Then Marion's eyes went past her. Lucian was standing near the door with his coat still on, and the old woman's face changed entirely, and she lifted one hand off the blanket and held it out toward him and said, clear as anything, "Thomas." Ellie went still. He crossed the room. He took the hand she was offering, and he sat down on the edge of the bed so she wouldn't have to reach, and Marion held on with both of hers and patted the back of his knuckles and said, "You're late. You're always late." And he said, "I know." And she seemed to find that entirely satisfactory. An aide came in with the afternoon cups and saw them and didn't break stride. "She does that," she said quietly to Ellie. "It's common in her stage. Any man who comes in, that's the name she reaches for. There's a gentleman visits his wife on Tuesdays, and she calls him that too." Ellie nodded. Her throat had gone tight, and she nodded again as though the first one hadn't been enough. Lucian sat there for 19 minutes and did not take his hand back once. He let her hold it and pat it and tell him twice that he was late, and when she finally drifted off mid-sentence, he waited another full minute before he stood up and set her hand down on the blanket, the way you'd set down something breakable. In the car, neither of them said anything until Cicero Avenue. Then Ellie said, "You didn't have to do that." "I know," he said, and that was all either of them said about it. 2 weeks after that, she was at his mother's house again on a Sunday, and after the meal, Rosalind went to lie down, and Ellie carried the plates to the sink out of pure habit, and turned on the tap, and found him standing beside her holding a dish towel with an expression of frank uncertainty. "Do you know how to do this?" she asked. "No." "Have you ever done it?" "No." She looked at him. "Not once? In your whole life?" "There has always," he said carefully, "been someone whose job it was." So she showed him. Hottest water he could stand. Glasses first, then plates, then the pans last, because the pans ruin the water, and she put a plate in his hands, and he held it under the stream, and looked down at the suds, running over his wrists, like a man observing a foreign custom. "That's soap," he said. "That's soap. It's warmer than I expected." And Ellie laughed at him, and he glanced sideways at her, and something in his face came loose for about a second and a half, and then went back. They did the whole sink that way. He was slow, and he was thorough, and he broke nothing. It was somewhere near the end of it, with his sleeves pushed up, and his hands in the water, that he said, without any let-in, "You're the first person in 20 years to touch my face for a reason that had nothing to do with blood." Ellie kept drying the glass she was holding. "That's a terrible sentence," she said. "It's a true one." She set the glass down. She had been carrying a question for weeks, and she had never found a place to set it down. And here was the place, apparently, a kitchen sink on a Sunday afternoon. "Have you done bad things?" she asked. He didn't pause and he didn't soften it. "Yes." "Do you lie to me?" "No." He turned the water off. "And I won't. You can ask me anything you want, whenever you want, and I'll either tell you the truth or I'll tell you I'm not going to answer. Those are the only 2 things you'll ever get from me." Ellie stood with the towel in her hands. She thought about how easy it would have been for him to say something better than that, something warmer, and how much less she would have believed it. "All right," she said. "I'll hold you to that." "I know you will," he said. "That's why I said it." And that was the whole of it. 2 people at a sink with wet hands, no promises past that one, and it would be 11 days before she asked him a question he didn't want to answer. And when she did, he kept his word, and it very nearly destroyed them both. He had never stopped working the 9 pages. All through those weeks, while a woman was teaching him to wash dishes, and his mother was feeding her green beans, Lucian Moretti had been sitting up 4 and 5 nights out of 7, with those columns spread across a desk, and by the middle of November he had the shape of it. The money left him through the yards. Not the front companies, the yards, which is to say the actual working end of the thing, gravel and freight and men in hard hats. And it went first into a contractor called Iron Line, which held real permits, ran real crews, and had done real work on real buildings in this city for 19 years. Iron Line sent a portion of it every quarter to the Safe Harbor Foundation as a corporate charitable contribution, which is a sentence that appears on tax filings all over America and raises nobody's eyebrows anywhere. And Safe Harbor did what it said it did. That was the part that took him longest to accept. It gave money to the families of construction workers who'd been hurt or killed on job sites. It gave real money, sometimes a great deal of it, and it gave it fast, often within a week, at the precise moment when a family is standing in a kitchen with a funeral to pay for, and no idea what happens next. He found 19 of those payments in the filings, and he found the pattern in about the 12th one. Every family that took the money signed a release, a settlement, a comprehensive agreement not to pursue any claim against any contractor, subcontractor, or supplier connected with the site, and a confidentiality clause on top of it. Sign here, and the check clears Friday. Don't sign, and go find a lawyer with the $400 you have left. He sat with that for a long time. It was, he thought, the most efficient thing he had ever seen. It didn't threaten anybody. It didn't have to. It simply arrived at the worst hour of a family's life, wearing the face of kindness. And it bought the one thing that mattered, which was silence. And it bought it at a discount, and it left everyone feeling they'd been helped. And the reason it worked in both directions was plain enough once he stopped looking for something complicated. A charitable foundation that runs money through it is a laundry with a good name on the door, and a congressman running statewide needs money that doesn't have a smell on it, doesn't show up on a disclosure with the wrong surname attached, doesn't get read aloud by anybody at a hearing. Iron Line needed the address. Warren Crandall needed the amount. Each of them had exactly what the other one couldn't get any other way. What Lucian could not find, anywhere in 9 pages, or in the 4 months of records he'd pulled since, was his own authorization. Not one. So on the 3rd Tuesday in November, he called Adrian Voss up to the office on Wacker. Voss came at 8 in the evening, took his coat off, hung it on the back of the door, and sat down heavily in the chair across the desk, the way he'd sat in that same chair when the desk had belonged to a different Moretti. Lucian pushed the folder across. Voss put on the reading glasses and went through it top to bottom, slowly, no skipping, the way he did everything. And it took him 11 minutes, and he didn't say a word for any of them. Then he took the glasses off and set them on his knee. "So it's Iron Line," he said. "It's Iron Line. You want my honest reaction? You're not going to like it. Give it to me." Voss rubbed his eyes with a thumb and forefinger. "Your father set that arrangement up in 2008, and I ran it for him for 3 years, and then he told me to stop asking questions about it. So I stopped asking questions about it. When he died, I inherited a machine with a lot of moving parts, and I never opened that particular one because I didn't have a reason to, and because opening it would have cost us the Crandall relationship. And at the time, we needed the Crandall relationship." He put the glasses back in his shirt pocket. "That's the truth, and it's ugly. And I'd rather you heard it from me sitting here than found it in a file." Lucian watched him. Voss didn't blink, and didn't look away, and didn't do any of the 17 small things a man does when he's assembling a sentence instead of remembering one. "Who's been signing?" Lucian said. "The quarterlies go out under Iron Line's own officers. It doesn't need you. It's never needed you. That's how your father built it, and nobody ever changed it, because nobody ever looked." He shrugged, heavily. "Which is on me. I'll wear that. Say it plainly." "I should have brought it to you 11 years ago," Voss said. "I didn't. I let it run because it was quiet, and quiet is the most expensive thing there is." He said one more thing before he left, and it was that last thing that ought to have sat wrong. He stood up and took his coat off the door and said, over his shoulder, "For what it's worth, none of those families got hurt by the arrangement. They all got paid. All of them. Not most. Not as far as I know. Not I'd have to look. All of them." Said by a man who had just finished explaining that he'd never opened that particular part of the machine. Lucian heard it. Some flat, cold thing at the back of his mind heard it and made a small mark and set it down, and then he let it go, because he was 37 years old, and this man had stood behind him at his father's funeral when half the city was waiting for him to do otherwise, and 20 years is not a fact you set aside for a preposition. She came off shift at 6:15 in the morning, and a woman was standing at the back of her car with a folder under one arm. "Miss Sawyer, my name is Catherine Doyle. I'm an assistant United States attorney for the Northern District of Illinois." She held up a credential and gave Ellie the time to read it, and then she put it away. "I've been trying to find you for about 5 weeks. I'd like 10 minutes. Ellie's hand was still on her keys. She had heard that name spoken once in her life, through a folding screen, by a woman who didn't know she was there. "I know who you are," Ellie said. "I doubt that," Doyle said, "but we'll get there." She set the folder down flat on the hood of the car and opened it. And she didn't rush and she didn't perform. In April of 2016, a section of scaffold came down at a site on the south end of Halstead. It was called the Halstead Yard Job. 1 man died. She turned the first page around so it faced Ellie. Ellie looked at it. There was a photograph clipped to the corner, and it was of her father, and it was the photograph off his work badge, and she had not seen that particular picture in 10 years. "His name was Thomas Sawyer," Doyle said. "Yes," Ellie said. Her voice sounded strange to her. "He was my dad." "I know. That's why I've been looking for you." Doyle turned another page. "In the 6 weeks before the collapse, your father filed 3 separate safety complaints with the Occupational Safety and Health Administration about that scaffold. 3. Here's the first one, here's the second, here's the third, and I want you to look at the dates, because they're 11 days apart, and then 9 days apart, which tells you he wasn't making noise. He was escalating." Ellie looked at the dates. 4 days before he died, Doyle went on. "He agreed to give a statement on the record to a federal investigator. That's this page. That's his signature on the intake." Another page. "The collapse occurred on a Thursday. The file was administratively closed the following Tuesday. 6 days. Cause of death, workplace accident, no further action, and everybody went home." Ellie put one hand on the hood of the car. She was aware, in a distant way, of the cold coming up through her palm. "You're telling me somebody closed it. I'm telling you what the record shows and letting you draw the obvious conclusion, which is what I'd do in front of a jury." Doyle's voice didn't change at all. "The file was reopened 4 months ago, under a different case number attached to a different investigation. When a matter like that gets reopened, we go and find the surviving family, because the family is usually the only party still alive who cares. Your mother's at St. Genevieve in Blue Island, and she can't be interviewed, and I confirmed that myself in September before I ever tried to reach you, which left you. How did you find me? You're going to like this even less." Doyle almost smiled, and didn't quite. "You worked the Safe Harbor Gala at the Rothmore in October. Your name is on the vendor staffing list for that night. So is Brightline Facility Services. So is your badge number. So is the time you clocked in." Ellie's mouth went dry. "I need you to understand," Doyle said, "that this isn't a coincidence, and I don't want you walking away from this car thinking it was. I was already looking for you. You happened to be standing in the one room in Cook County where every person I'm interested in was standing at the same time. That's not fate. That's the way this city works. It's 400 people at a fundraiser, and about 9 of them matter." Then she turned to the last page and slid it forward. "This is the labor and staffing contractor of record at Halstead Yard in 2016. Ellie read the line. She read it a second time, and underneath it, in the smaller type where they put the corporate parentage, was a name she had first seen on a temporary badge clipped to her own chest, printed under a photograph of shipping terminals she'd looked at once on a bus. She stood there in the cold with her hand flat on the hood of a car, and she thought, before anything else, of a room in Blue Island with a handrail along both walls, of her mother reaching out, of a man in a dark coat, crossing that room and sitting down on the edge of the bed so an old woman wouldn't have to reach, and taking her hand and holding it for 19 minutes and not once letting go. And Marion had looked at him and said, "Thomas." She said it to the man who visits on Tuesdays too, the aide had told her. She says it to every man who comes in. Ellie had believed that. She still believed it. It was medically true. It was simply what happens in that stage of the disease. But she was going to hear that word in her sleep for a very long time. "I've read your file," Doyle said. "You've got no record. You've never been in a room with any of these people until 9 weeks ago. And as far as I can tell, you got the job you have now, honestly. That makes you the only person in this thing who's clean." She closed the folder. "I need you to wear a wire." Ellie didn't answer. The sky over the lot had started to go gray at one edge. "I'm not going to tell you what your father would have wanted," Doyle said, "because I didn't know him and you did. Take the week. Here's my card. It has my direct line and it has my cell, and you can call either one at any hour, and if you decide against it, I'll never contact you again." She put the card on the hood. Then she walked off toward her own car and left Ellie standing there, with the wind coming across the pavement and her keys still in her hand. She didn't call Catherine Doyle. She went to the office on Wacker that same evening, walked past the man at the desk who knew her badge, rode up alone, and put the folder down on Lucian Moretti's desk without knocking. He looked at her face first and the folder second, and something in him went cold, because she wasn't crying. He had seen a great many people stand in front of that desk, and he had learned what all of it meant. The shouting and the pleading and the wet eyes and the hands, and there was nothing on her at all. She was perfectly calm and perfectly white, and her voice, when it came, was level. "You told me you don't lie to me." "I don't." "Then open that," she said, "and tell me if my father's name is in it." He opened it. He read the first page and stopped, and read it again, and then he went through the rest of it the way Voss went through things. Slowly, top to bottom, and by the fourth page, his jaw had set. He picked up the phone. "Sit down," he said, and when she didn't move, he didn't ask twice. He made 3 calls in front of her, and he didn't send her out of the room for any of them. The first was to a lawyer whose name she didn't catch, and it lasted 4 minutes and consisted mostly of him listening. The second was to somebody at the yards, and he asked for a box of paper files from 2016, physically, tonight. And he said the words Halsted Yard out loud twice. The third call he made standing up, with his back half turned, and it was short, and at the end of it he said, "Then find it, and call me back," and set the phone down. They waited. Ellie stood the entire time. It took 40 minutes. When the call back came, he listened for perhaps 90 seconds, said thank you, hung up, and stood there with his hand still on the receiver. Then he turned around and looked at her. "In April of 2016, I was 27 years old, and I was in Italy," he said. "I had been for 9 months. I did not order it. I didn't know about it, and I didn't hear the name Halsted Yard until 11 minutes ago." He paused. "That's the part that's in my favor, and it's the smaller part. So I'm going to say the rest of it now, and I'm not going to soften it. My father authorized the arrangement that closed your father's file. His signature is on the instruction. Adrian Voss carried it out. It was handled through the foundation, the way all of them were handled, which means it was fast, and it was quiet, and it looked like help." Ellie didn't move. "How much?" she said. He hesitated for the first time. "Say it." $75,000, Lucian said. "Paid out 11 days after the collapse. It's recorded in the foundation's books as a hardship grant. It went into an account in your mother's name." And that was the moment her legs went. She got a hand on the back of the chair and lowered herself into it and sat there staring at the edge of his desk, because she had just understood something, and it was not what he thought she'd understood. It wasn't the sum. It wasn't the word hardship sitting on top of it like a lid. It was that she knew that money. She had lived inside that money. She had been 19 years old, and her mother had told her there was some help from the company, some kind of fund, and for 2 years that money had paid the rent on the apartment in Bridgeport, and then it had paid the first deposit at St. Genevieve, and the first 14 months after that, and it had run out in the spring of 2019, and Ellie had been working 3 jobs ever since to replace it. She had eaten on that money. She had finished the second year of a 2-year program on that money before she had to quit. Her mother was lying tonight in a bed that money had bought, in the only room she still recognized. Every safe thing that had happened to the 2 of them in 10 years had been purchased at the exact price of never asking why the scaffold came down. "It's what we lived on," Ellie said. She wasn't looking at him. "That's what it was. That's what they gave us." He didn't say anything. "You understand what I'm telling you? I'm telling you my mother's got a bed because somebody paid us to shut up about how my dad died." She lifted her head. "And I've spent 10 years being grateful to them." Lucian Moretti stood on the other side of that desk and did not apologize. Ellie would think about that a great deal afterward, and she would understand eventually that he'd known it would have been an obscenity, that no arrangement of words from him could touch a single hour of it, and that offering some anyway would only have been a way of making himself feel better in front of her. What he said instead, when he finally said anything, was this: "I can't give any of that back to you. There's nothing I can do about your father, and there's nothing I can do about 10 years. He stopped. "All I can do is make sure it doesn't happen to the next one." Ellie stood up. She was steady, and she picked up her bag and she walked to the door and put her hand on it. "Then do it," she said. And then she said, "Don't call me," and she went out, and she got all the way to the elevator, and all the way down, and all the way across the lobby, and out onto Wacker, before she stopped being calm, and there was nobody there to see it, and that was how she wanted it. 9 days later, somebody knocked on her door at 10:20 at night, and Ellie looked through the peephole and did not open it, and stood there with her hand on the frame for a while. The woman on the other side knocked again. "Miss Sawyer, it's Vivian Crandall. I know exactly how this looks, and I'm asking for 4 minutes." Ellie opened the door on the chain first, and then all the way, and let her in. Vivian Crandall was wearing a wool coat over ordinary clothes, and no jewelry at all. Not a ring, not an earring, nothing at her throat, and her eyes had the swollen quality of a woman who's been sleeping in stretches of 2 hours. She looked around the apartment once, briefly, without comment, and then she stayed standing in the middle of it because Ellie hadn't offered her anything and she hadn't expected to be offered. "My husband has retained his own counsel," she said. "Separate from mine. That happened on Monday. Do you know what that means?" "No. It means the marriage is a legal position now, not a marriage." She said it flatly. "There are 11 years of safe harbor filings, and the foundation was structured with a governing board, and I sat on that board, and my signature is on every single one of them. I signed them at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee, 40 or 50 at a time, the way you sign school forms, and I never read one." She let that stand. "Warren's people are going to say I ran it, that I directed the disbursements, that I set the terms of the releases, that I was the one who chose which families got approached and when. And the paper supports every word of it, because the paper has my name on it and doesn't have his." "Then get a lawyer," Ellie said. "I have 3. Vivian almost laughed. "They've told me what the best outcome looks like, and the best outcome is that I go first, cooperate fully, and hope the office finds him more interesting than me. That's the ceiling. That's the very top of what's available." She reached into the pocket of her coat and took out a small external drive, black, no bigger than a deck of cards, and held it flat on her palm. "This is the foundation's internal accounting. 11 years of it, the real set, not the filings. It's 34 families, Miss Sawyer. 34. Every approach, every amount, every release, and the internal notes about which ones were likely to push and which ones weren't." She turned her hand slightly so the drive caught the light, and there's a call log from April of 2016 with a recorded line on it. "My husband kept recordings of everything for 20 years because he was frightened of being alone in a room with somebody's word against his. He never once considered that they'd be evidence against him instead of for him." Ellie didn't reach for it. "There's a conversation on there from the afternoon your father died," Vivian said. "I've listened to it. I'm not going to tell you what's on it, because you should hear it from a prosecutor with a lawyer in the room, and not from me standing in your doorway at 10 at night." "Why are you giving it to me?" Ellie said. "Why not straight to Doyle?" "Because if I hand it to that office myself, it's a bargaining chip. My attorney trades it for consideration, and it becomes part of a negotiation about me, about my exposure, about how many years I do or don't spend somewhere, and I've decided I don't want it to be that." Vivian's jaw moved. "I want somebody to have it who's got nothing to gain. I looked at that list of 34 names for a long time, and yours was the only one I'd ever stood in a room with." Ellie took it. It weighed almost nothing. "You could still be doing this to save yourself," she said. "Of course I could," Vivian said. "I'd think that too. It happens to also be the right thing, and I'm past caring whether anybody believes both can be true at once." She buttoned her coat. Then she stopped, with her hand on the top button, and she looked at Ellie directly for the first time since she'd come in. "I want to say one thing and then I'll go, and you don't have to answer it." Ellie waited. "That night," Vivian said, "I did what I did to a man because I'd decided in about half a second that he was nothing. I didn't hate him. That's the part I keep coming back to. I wasn't angry at him. I didn't know him. I'd never see him again. He was simply nothing, and there were people watching, and nothing is free." She took a breath. "And you crossed that entire room and cleaned his face because you decided he was a person. That's the whole difference between us. That's it. That's the only thing that was ever different." She got the button done. "I'm 44 years old. I've had money my whole life, and a house, and a name people return calls for. And I stood in that ballroom and found out which one of us had less, and it wasn't you." She went to the door and opened it herself. "Doyle's direct line is better than the switchboard," she said. Call it in the morning, not tonight. She'll want you to have a lawyer with you, and she'll be right. And then she was gone down the stairs. And Ellie stood in her own kitchen, holding 34 families in the palm of her hand. She called Doyle's direct line at 9 in the morning with a lawyer beside her, and the drive changed hands at 11, and a federal office that had been working with fragments for 4 months suddenly had 11 years of somebody's real books. These things do not stay quiet. By Thursday, 3 subpoenas had gone out that hadn't existed on Monday, and one of them went to Iron Line Contracting, and it asked for correspondence by name, and the name it asked for was Adrian Voss. He had until then been a man who could explain everything. That ended with a piece of paper. What happened after that happened in one night, and it happened in 3 places at once. The first was on Lake Street in Fulton Market at 11:10, where the car was at the curb with the engine running, and Gianni Renzi behind the wheel, and Lucian coming down the 4 steps from a restaurant door. Gianni saw the second vehicle come up the block wrong. That was all it was, a car moving at a speed that didn't match the street, and he had about a second and a half, and he used it to put the transmission in gear and swing the wheel hard, so that the driver's side came around between the sidewalk and whatever was coming. Then there was a sound like a bag of glass going over, and the windshield went white and sagged, and the second car was already at the end of the block and gone. Lucian got the door open. Gianni was upright with both hands still on the wheel, and he was breathing in a fast, shallow way through his teeth, and there was a dark patch spreading across the shoulder of his jacket. "I'm all right," he said. "Don't." "I'm all right, boss. It's the shoulder. I can move it. Look." He moved it, and made a sound doing it, and Lucian put his hand flat against the man's collarbone to keep him still, and got on the phone. He did not call an ambulance. He called a number he had used 4 times in 11 years, and a doctor in a building on Damon was waiting with the lights on inside of 9 minutes, and Gianni Renzi walked in under his own power and swore about the jacket the entire way, and he was going to be fine, and he would carry that shoulder stiff in cold weather for the rest of his life. The second place was Lake Forest. Somebody called the house before Lucian could stop it going out, because a car of his had been shot at in the middle of the city, and a certain number of people needed to know inside the hour, and one of them made the wrong assumption about who else needed to. Rosalind Moretti took the call standing at the kitchen counter at 20 past midnight. What the man on the phone said was that there had been an incident on Lake Street and that they were still confirming. That was the whole of it. It was enough. She set the phone down and put her hand out for the edge of the counter, and did not find it on the first try. The woman who kept the house heard the stool go over and came in and found her on the floor with her back against the cabinet, gray, sweating, one fist closed hard against her breastbone, and that woman did the single most important thing anybody did that entire night, which was to call the paramedics before she called anyone in the family. Rosalind was in the cath lab at Lake Forest Hospital by 1:40, and they put a stent in her at 2:15. And the interventional cardiologist told them afterward that the 20 minutes they hadn't wasted were the 20 minutes that mattered. The third place was a bus shelter on Ashland, at 4 blocks from Ellie's building, at 11:40 at night, where she was standing alone under the light, because the 8 had run late, and she had been on her feet since 6 the previous evening. She had the strap of her bag across her chest. She heard the vehicle pull up behind the shelter, and she did what anybody does, which is nothing, because vehicles pull up all the time. A man got out on the near side and said her name, not Miss Sawyer, Ellie, like they were acquainted. She turned and started walking, and she got perhaps 11 steps. And then there was a second man ahead of her on the sidewalk, who had not been there a moment before, and he wasn't hurrying, and he didn't need to. "Somebody wants 5 minutes with you," he said. "That's all this is." She did the smart thing and did not scream, because there was nobody on that block to hear it, and she got her phone out of her coat pocket and had her thumb on it before the first man reached her, and took it out of her hand as gently as a man takes a menu off a table. They put her in the back seat. Nobody touched her after that. They drove her 22 minutes south and east until the streetlights ran out, and the road went to broken concrete, and they walked her into a building that smelled like rust and standing water, and they sat her on a steel folding chair in the middle of an empty floor under one work light, and then they went and stood by the door and didn't look at her. At 12:51 in the morning, standing in a hallway in Lake Forest Hospital with a doctor's hand on his arm, and his mother behind 2 doors and a phone in his other hand, Lucian Moretti received a photograph. It was Ellie, on the chair, under the light, her hands folded in her lap. Underneath it was a single line of text. "Do you want to keep the Moretti name? Or do you want to keep the cleaning lady? He stood in that hallway for 4 minutes with the phone in his hand. At one end of it was a set of double doors with a keypad, and his mother on the other side of them. At the other end was a corridor that ran to an elevator that ran to a garage where a car was idling with 2 men in it who would drive anywhere, he said. He was still standing there when the recovery nurse came out and told him she was awake and asking, and that he could have 5 minutes and not 6. Rosalind Moretti was flat on her back with a line taped to the back of her hand, and her color coming up out of gray towards something almost human. And she looked at her son's face for about 2 seconds before she said, "Something's happened. Nothing you need tonight. Don't." Her voice had no strength in it, and it cut anyway. "I've been lied to by professionals, and by your father, who was better at it than you. Where is she?" He told her. 6 sentences, no arrangement. She lay there and took it in, and then her hand came up off the sheet an inch, and he took it. "Now listen to me," she said, "because they'll be back in here in 3 minutes, and I want this said properly." Her thumb moved once against his knuckles. "In September, I bet you 30 days. And you thought I was betting on whether some woman out there would love you?" She stopped and got her breath. "I never bet on that, Lucian. I know what you are, and I know what following you costs, and I've never once in my life expected a stranger to volunteer for it." Her eyes stayed on him. "I was betting on you. On whether there was anything left in there that could still love somebody back. That was the whole wager. That's what I've been sitting in that house for 11 years waiting to find out." She let go of his hand. "Go and get her. You're 2 hours out of a cath lab, and I'll be here in the morning, and if I'm not, you standing in the hall won't have changed it." Her chin came up half an inch off the pillow. "Go." He went. What he did in the next 4 hours he did from the back of a moving car with a laptop open on the seat beside him, and none of it involved a gun. The first thing he did was send. There were 9 men in that city who ran their own crews and paid up to him and had done for years, and to each of the 9 he sent the same file, personalized, containing only the pages that concerned that man, not what Voss had taken from Lucian, what Voss had taken from him. 9 years of it, skimmed off the top of their own tribute before it ever reached the house, shaved thin enough that no one man's share would have been worth a war, and totaled across 9 men into something that took the breath out of you. Attached to each file was one line. "Verify it yourself, then decide where you're standing at sunrise." By 3:10 in the morning, 6 of the 9 had called back. By 4:30, the 7th had. Adrian Voss went to bed a man with an organization behind him, and woke up a man with a warehouse and 11 employees. The second thing he did was call his own attorney at 2 in the morning, and put him in a room with Catherine Doyle at 5. What happened in that room is a thing that happens more often in America than people imagine. Lucian Moretti signed a proffer agreement, and then sat down across a table from a federal prosecutor and began to talk, with counsel present and a court reporter running, about matters he had never spoken aloud in his life. He gave her the internal accounting. He gave her the yards, the routing, the mechanism, the names of the officers who signed the quarterlies, and he set 2 conditions before he said a word, and he did not move off either one: that the office would pursue a court-ordered restitution for all 34 families out of the assets it was going to seize regardless, and that not one of those families would be charged with anything for having signed what they signed at the worst hour of their lives, because a woman with a funeral to pay for and a release form in front of her is not a co-conspirator, whatever the paper says. Then he told her about April of 2016. All of it. His father's authorization, the mechanism of the closure, the payment, and the fact that the organization he had inherited and run for 11 years had been the labor contractor of record at Halstead Yard. Doyle wrote for a long time without speaking. When she finally set the pen down, she looked at him across that table the way you look at a thing you have no category for. "Mr. Moretti," she said, "I want to be certain you understand what you've just done. You've handed me the knife. I will use it. On you, on your holdings, on 20 years of your life, and I won't be able to stop it once it's moving even if I wanted to. I know what a proffer is." "Then tell me why." Lucian Moretti sat back in the chair. "My father buried a man," he said, "because that man wanted to go home safely at the end of a shift. That's all he did. He filed 3 complaints, and he wanted to go home." He looked at her steadily. "You want the knife? Take it. I'm finished carrying it." He walked into the warehouse on the Calumet at 6:15 in the morning, alone, with nothing in his hands and nothing under his coat, and he was wearing the wool jacket that had gone thin at the elbows. and the shoes that had belonged to somebody who worked for a living, because his mother had put them in a garment bag in September, and he had never given them back. Ellie saw him come through the door, and she came up off the steel chair about 2 inches before she made herself sit back down. There were 4 men on the floor, and Adrian Voss was standing near the work light with his reading glasses in his shirt pocket. And he looked at what Lucian was wearing, and his face did something complicated. "You came in that. You know where it came from." "I do." Voss nodded slowly. "Your mother's a piece of work." "Adrian." Lucian took out his phone and set it on an oil drum and put it on speaker and let it play. It was a voice memo, and the first voice on it belonged to a man who ran the near West Side, and what he said was 11 seconds long, and it ended with the words, "We're done with you." Then a second voice, from the yards on the far south end, 40 seconds, colder. Then a third. Lucian didn't say anything while it played. He simply stood there with his hands loose at his sides and watched Voss's men, and by the middle of the second recording, one of them had stepped back off the line, and by the end of the third, there were 2 of them left. And then there was one, and then that one walked past Lucian without meeting his eyes, and the door banged in the frame behind him. Voss took the pistol out of his waistband. He didn't raise it right away. He held it down along his leg for a moment, the way a tired man holds a hat. Then he brought it up. Ellie stopped breathing. Lucian didn't move at all. "You'll want to think about the next 4 seconds, he said. "So I'll make them simple for you. There's a proffer with my signature on it, sitting in a federal building on Dearborn. And it went in at 5 o'clock this morning. And everything you've done since 2008 is in it. If you fire that, you die in a federal prison. If you set it down, you die in a federal prison. That part's finished, Adrian. There's no version of this morning where that changes." He let it sit. "The only thing left that you get to decide is whether she walks out of this building. Somewhere out past the loading doors, faint, and then not faint, a siren came up the access road, and then another, and then the sound of vehicles on broken concrete." Voss listened to it. He was 45 years old, and he had stood behind a boy at a funeral 11 years ago, when he could have taken everything. And whatever it was in him that had made him do that was apparently still in there somewhere, because he turned the pistol around, held it by the barrel, and set it down on the oil drum next to the phone. Nobody was hurt. Catherine Doyle came through the door 90 seconds later with the marshals, and Adrian Voss put his hands behind his back and gave them no trouble at all. Lucian crossed the floor and took off the old wool jacket and put it around Ellie's shoulders, and she looked up at him and got out one word. "Why that one?" And he said, "Because it's what you saw the first time," and that was all either of them managed for a while. Within 72 hours it had all come down. Warren Crandall was indicted on wire fraud and obstruction of justice, and resigned his seat by the end of the week. Vivienne Crandall took a cooperation agreement, surrendered the house, the accounts, and every other thing she'd been afraid to lose, and then sat in an open courtroom and testified about 11 years of it, under her own name, with her chin up. Blake Hartigan lost his professional fundraiser registration with the Illinois Attorney General's office and was gone from the sector inside a month. The Safe Harbor Foundation was dissolved and reconstituted under court supervision, and Moretti Harbor Group entered into an agreement that put an independent monitor inside the company with the authority to look at anything he wanted for the next 5 years. And on a Tuesday in March, at St. Genevieve in Blue Island, Marion Sawyer looked up from the chair by the window, found her daughter's face, and knew it. It lasted perhaps 90 seconds. That's how the disease works. It gives you a window, and then it closes it. And Ellie had learned not to waste one. "Your father took his lunch that day," Marion said. "The tin one. I packed it the night before." She was looking straight at her. "He told me he was going to do the right thing on Monday, and then he didn't come home, and nobody ever told me what he meant. And I have been angry at that man for 10 years because I thought he'd left us on purpose." Ellie held her mother's hands and told her the truth. All of it, in about 40 words, and watched 10 years go out of that woman's face. A year later, the Thomas Sawyer Safe Harbor Fund made its first disbursement. Real money, no releases, no confidentiality clauses, nothing to sign but a receipt. Ellie Sawyer runs it. She wasn't appointed and she wasn't handed it. The 34 families elected her. Rosalind Moretti was in the second row that morning, with a cane she uses mostly for emphasis, and afterward she looked at her son and said, "A year late. You still lost that bet." And he said, "You told me you were betting on something else." And she said, "I was, and I won." He gave Ellie the ring that evening, and it was sitting in the middle of a folded square of white linen, and she knew exactly which one it was, and she didn't say anything for a long time. 400 people were in that ballroom. 400 of them saw a man with cake on his face, and one of them saw a human being, and everything that followed came out of that single difference. Here's the thing worth carrying out of this story. The way you treat someone who you believe can do nothing for you and nothing to you, that is not a small part of your character. That is your character, the whole of it, and it is showing whether or not anybody important is watching. Ellie Sawyer didn't know who that man was. That's exactly the point. She would have knelt down for anyone. If this story moved you, please subscribe to our channel and give it a like and share it with someone who could use it today. We'd truly love to hear what it stirred in you, so tell us in the comments, and tell us about the person in your own life who saw you when nobody else bothered to look. Thank you for spending this time with us. We wish you good health, a peaceful heart, and quiet joy in your days, and we'll see you in the next video.